Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne. Thank you for finding me on this very warm day, I must say, here in Melbourne. And if you're curious, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne without any help from much knowledge or greenhouses or equipment of any sort, grow lights, humidifiers. Really, it's just them and me struggling along outside or inside or not at all. So plant lovers of the world, if they sound like your no fuss conditions, do be tempted to hit subscribe and the notification bell because I post every week on a Friday, amateur ramblings, but they might help you in your orchid journey. And today, plant lovers, it is very hot here. It's in the 30s and it's muggy. It's not sunny, so it's an unusual day for Melbourne. It sort of feels more subtropical. And very windy, and I've already had some orchid crises outside, which I must go and attend to. Things have blown out of their pots, goodness me, which does happen in this sort of weather. Anyway, I digress, because what is before us but the most beautiful flowering orchid? Yes, look at that. Isn't it the most sensational thing? Now, a few weeks ago, I made my epic watering video, which I had been resistant about doing because there isn't a simple, quick answer. It is so variable and depends on so many different things. But anyway, watch that video should you be vaguely interested. But I did feature this plant because it's an Oncidium type, and look at its growth. It's mega, massive, and running for the hills. And it had a spike at the time, and I did say I will do a video about it when it comes out because it has no tag, and I had no idea what the flower is going to be. Well, look at it. Pretty sensational. So it kind of lends itself to a particular video, which is really about Oncidium Alliance, which is what this is, but we'll get to that in a minute, and their general care. So this video, plant lovers, is about Oncidium hybrids and how to grow them. Well, how I grow this one. They're all pretty much for muchness, but anyway, let's get right into it. Okay, first things first, this one is a poor nameless orphan. I think I bought this from my favorite nursery, Fitzroy Nursery, and they have a lot of Oncidium Alliance orchids, and they just always have a tag that says Oncidium orchid. Not very helpful, which is, fair enough. Most of those hybrids that you find in garden centers or florists or specialist plant growers are going to have pretty similar growing conditions. So I guess you don't really need to know what it is. But there are so many hybrids, goodness me, that I don't know. You don't need to know what it is, but I'm always curious to see. Anyway, this one had a dead flower spike, and the great thing about that nursery is the minute the flower spike dies, they reduce the plant. And it was a very chunky plant, as you can see. Look at those pseudobulbs there. And not that I need any more Oncidium Alliance orchids in my life, but I felt I couldn't live without it because I did see how large the flowers were and the faded color, which now I'm remembering. No ID, but who cares really? It is the most enormous plant. But what we can do is just by looking at the flower shape and understanding that it is an Oncidium Alliance hybrid. So just to backtrack, the Oncidium group is an ever-changing group of orchids from the Americas. So there's some in Florida and then sort of Central America, and I think there's one species in Brazil. So that kind of bandwidth of Southern United States, Central America, and Northern South America. And some are high altitude growers, which we'll get to, and some are not. So cooler growers, warmer growers, which of course will determine how you actually do grow your Oncidium hybrid plant. And then obviously all of those types of plants in that alliance, which include Miltonias, which include Brassicas and Odontoglossums and Oncidiums, they can all be hybridized, so they're receptive to one another. So over the years, of course, it's created a huge array of these very complex hybrids between the species, and then the various hybrids have been crossed, etc., to emphasize flower shape, flower color, fragrance, form, size, because I mean, this is enormous. And they tend to be the sort of Oncidiums that you find most commonly in garden centers, nurseries, florists. The more specialist growers will have probably more species types of Oncidiums. And they are, I mean, depends on your conditions, but they can be as easy to grow and as interesting, but it's just a slightly different kettle of fish. They tend to be less flashy, less big, and often will only flower once a year, whereas many of the hybrids have been created really to produce a flower spike with each new growth, and you can get sometimes two, sometimes three growth cycles in a year depending on what you've got and how you're growing it. So the Oncidium Alliance is a varied beast, and it covers a multitude of sins, including essentially warm and hot growers. So we'll get to that in a minute, but it's kind of useful to know what you've got. So back to the unlabeledness of this one. Luckily, here I am in Melbourne, which is not tropical and not hot. And this was in a regular nursery, which is not very humid and a tropical nursery at all. So the assumption would be it is a cooler growing hybrid because it's come from a grower locally. So that's the first assumption. So trying to find out what it was. Now, or what it is. Firstly, you have to wait till it blooms. That's the sort of the golden rule of botanical identification, really. Wait till it flowers and have a look. Now, there are so many versions of Oncidium type orchids out there, it's quite difficult, but I will tell you a little secret, plant lovers. Well, two things. Firstly, you can just look at the website of a great nursery in your neck of the woods that has a lot of Oncidiums, and just look at all the images of all the flowering types and see if you can find something that bears a resemblance to your flower. So the form, particularly how the petals and sepals are arranged, their size, color to some degree sometimes, but really it's really more about the form of the flower. So see if you can kind of see that, get the identification for that, whether it's a Beallara or Wilsonara, whatever, and then just Google that type, like Wilsonara images, and just see all the different images that come up and see if you can spot yours. That might help you narrow it down. The other thing is, who knew that Google image search was so accurate? So I thought this morning, you know what? I'm just going to Google image search the flower, and it popped up immediately with Beallara. And that is a complex hybrid between many, many different types. And unfortunately, of course, as is the way with lots of things, the name Beallara has been moved on, and because of the change in so many of the allocations of various species, this is now called Aliceara, and they are essentially a hybrid between Miltonias, Oncidiums, and Brassicas. Now, all of those plants have very different growth habits and requirements, so quite tricky to then figure out what yours wants. But I think essentially in this world of complex hybrid Oncidiums, there are the warm growers and the cooler growers. And I obviously am magnetically drawn to cooler growers because that really suits my climate here, because it ain't tropical and it's not super humid and it's not warm, and I don't have a heated greenhouse. So we've established it's a Beallara or Aliceara, and Beallara was kind of easy to get your head around because it was named after the nursery where the hybrid was first created. Aliceara, I can't find, maybe it was an Alice who decided to name this type. Who knows? Anyway, that's what they're called now. But interesting. I mean, one of the first observations is Miltonias tend to be very running, so their rhizome sort of runs and creeps along whatever they're growing on, and often a bit vertically. So you can see here, this plant has definitely got that Miltonia characteristic of running and rooting and running and rooting. But I thought, you know what, let me just do some basic research. So Brassica and Miltonia, let's just leave those aside for a second. Miltonia, I think a lot of Miltonias do very well in Melbourne for me, although they're not often classified as cool growers. They seem to just very much like my climate. So Miltonias I'm fine with. Oncidiums, there are these two different types: the higher altitude cool ones, which love here, and then the lower level ones, which are more tropical or subtropical, warmer growers anyway, let's just say. So I thought, why don't I just have a look at one of the Bibles of orchid growing? So Growing Orchids by J.N. Rentoul. Now, he was an Australian grower, and this was published, I think, in the very early 80s, 1982. And he was born in 1909, so he's an Edwardian, Mr. Rentoul. But it's 4 volumes, and it covers basically every orchid type. Obviously 1980, 81, so much has changed from a nomenclature perspective since then, and a lot of orchids have been discovered since then. So that's the naming information isn't obviously totally accurate, and it never will be because it's constantly changing. But if you can sort of go back a few names, you'll probably find what you're looking for in these books. But for me here, because he was a cooler grower in southern Australia, his information is perfect for me. So I'd imagine for many other growers around the world, his type of knowledge and information will be useful. So see if you can find it. J.N. Rentoul, they're not in print anymore, but have a Google around and see if you can find them on secondhand book sites. Growing Orchids, 4 volumes. You can of course just choose the volume you want. There's one on Australian orchids exclusively. This one is the Cattleyas and other epiphytes, which is a lot of plants. Anyway, I was curious what he said about Oncidiums in this climate. So the first thing that he mentions is that they were some of the earliest orchids to have been brought into cultivation in Europe. So the very early 19th century, so sort of 1800 to 1830, a lot were brought in. And in fact, reading this, one of the terrible facts is literally millions of plants were taken from the wild and shipped to Europe, most of which died because no one really understood the climatic conditions. A lot of those early ones were taken from high altitude, cooler growing places and didn't thrive in Europe. They flowered once in an effort to survive and then died. Just imagine 1 million plants. That is a lot. No wonder so many of them are endangered or extinct in the wild. Anyway, we need to forgive ourselves and move on from that front. So then you had the introduction of the plants early 19th century. People tried to grow them. By the end of the century, so the 1890s, 1900, people had really started to hybridize between the different species and starting to create some intergeneric hybrids based on flower and fragrance and form and blah, blah, blah. And then they kind of went out of fashion for a large chunk of the 20th century. And it wasn't until sort of the 70s and 80s that people really started getting back into the hybridizing thing. And now, of course, lots and lots. So interesting, just the wax and wane of fashion with these plants. I think it's fair to say now there's a lot of work going on in hybridizing and developing more interesting strains. Anyway, back to the oracle. Okay, here's some interesting factoids. The roots of Oncidiums are much the same as other epiphytes, with a proportion of free and aerial and the remainder acting as an anchorage for the plants as feeders. Aerial roots seldom grow further when inserted into potting material. So one of the issues with my plant, as you can see, is all of those aerial roots. And my fear would be that they do need to get themselves into something. So the whole issue of potting this as it gets bigger is going to be an issue, but I'll get to that. The other point he makes is that it is not possible to be too certain and lay down hard and fast rules for Oncidiums because of their widespread occurrence in the same species common to several localities and indeed several countries. So he's talking about species, obviously, but the species ancestors of all of these complex hybrids will determine to some degree how to look after it. Okay, book number 2, Exotic Orchids in Australia by David L. Jones. Again, this is out of print, but you might be able to find it. This has an interesting generalization about Oncidiums and hybrid Oncidiums, which I find fascinating. So, as we've just said, those species from high elevations in the Andes are cool growers, whereas those originating in lowlands require heat. Those species which have tall, pear-shaped pseudobulbs are in continual growth throughout the year and need to be kept continually moist and do not have a high light requirement. However, terete leaf species, so species which have smaller, rounder leaves, those with very small pseudobulbs and those with nearly round pseudobulbs should be allowed to dry out between waterings every 2 or 3 days. They will also tolerate bright light, but if the leaves begin to turn red, then reduce the light intensity somewhat. And finally, equitant species are not as tolerant of dryness as the larger leaf types. And equitant means the leaves overlap like Tolomnia, for example. So maybe some of the sort of twinkle type of Oncidiums as well. So essentially they do not want to dry out. Very interesting. Many Oncidiums suffer badly from root rotting. Had that. Underpotting is better than overpotting, and buoyant air movement is important for these orchids, which, as a general rule, do not require high humidity. So there's some interesting thoughts, particularly about the size of pseudobulbs. So obviously, again, they're talking about species, but you can kind of see large pear-shaped pseudobulbs, meaning this type is in constant growth, meaning it does need constant watering and fertilizing as it's doing something. And that's kind of logical. If an orchid is doing something, it will require some help. If it's not, if it's in dormancy, obviously it won't. Now, the last book we're going to consult is Orchids at Kew, edited by Joyce Stewart. There you go. Another book well out of date, unfortunately. Kind of interesting, but more generalist and a bit more of a history about Kew Gardens, perhaps, than orchids in general. But there was an interesting factoid about an Oncidium here. So Oncidium onustum, for example, grows as an epiphyte only on certain cacti in the coastal desert of Peru and Ecuador. My goodness, imagine trying to grow that in cultivation. Anyway, so always good to consult some books and just get a sense of, well, what am I doing? Is it right? And I think some takeaways, some general takeaways are, all this complexity will give you two types, one that requires more warmth and one that is cooler growing. So if you can, try and figure out where your hybrid comes from, and you can do that by going to orchidroots.com, and I'll put that along here as a caption. Orchid Roots will tell you the origin of your hybrid. Now, mine doesn't have a name, but if I were to put any sort of Beallara hybrid name in there, it will show you ultimately what the species ancestors are. Then you can go to orchidspecies.com, and I'll put that below here, and you can just research the climatic origins of those particular species and then make an educated guess. Because orchidroots.com will tell you the percentage of DNA from each of the original species. So something that probably has sort of 50% or more is probably going to be more dominant in some way. Anyway, there you can try and figure out what to do. So I think, though, we can come to some generalizations, which is moderate indirect light. So not super bright indirect light that you might give a cattleya, but a few degrees lower or further away from the window. The cooler ones can certainly take indoor temperatures like a house plant, but really I think all of those can take my outdoor minimum. So one of the things that the books generally say is that around 10 degrees centigrade, which is the 50s Fahrenheit, is okay, but they can go a little lower. And I think particularly if they're drier in those cooler temperatures. So I experimented this winter with keeping a lot more of mine outside, my Oncidium hybrids, because I just don't have the space inside. And they've all survived and thrived. Although I must say, this one wasn't one of them. This was indoors all winter. So, moderate light. The other thing then is watering. I would just let the plant tell you what it's doing. So if it is producing a new growth, it is active, I would, once that growth is kind of got a decent height and it's got some decent root activity, increase your watering. In winter, it's a good idea just to dial it down anyway. And if the plant's not doing much, I would really dial it down and allow it to dry to some degree. Their point was, though, these larger pseudobulb plants probably need more consistent moisture than the smaller pseudobulb plants. And the pseudobulbs will give you an idea too. They will obviously shrivel if it's very dry, and they will fatten up the minute that you water it. So a little bit of shriveling on your pseudobulbs isn't too alarming. So this little baby, whatever it might be, well, it's a Beallara, but whatever the actual name is, look at the size of the flowers. I mean, they are massive. It's the size of an espresso saucer. From one who doesn't drink coffee. But anyway, there we are. And the most beautiful, deep, mauvey purple, I suppose, with beautiful gold flecks, an absolutely stunning orchid. Now, I hadn't staked it, hence it looks a little bit odd at the moment because the flowers aren't aligned properly. But the spike's actually quite heavy, and I was just worried that it was going to snap. So I generally don't like staking flower spikes because I just feel it looks more natural unstaked. But sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. And it would have been better to have staked this as the flower spike was emerging, because then the flowers would open in relation to how it's been staked. Now on this one, you can see that the flower spike has come from the very tip of the pseudobulb, which is a little unusual. Often with an Oncidium, it's going to come from the leaf axis towards the base, but not in this case. So for me, this is down, and in fact in my watering video you would have seen where it is. It's downstairs in a north facing window, which in the southern hemisphere gets the most indirect light, and in winter actually it gets slightly stronger indirect light, and in summer slightly shadier indirect light because the sun's higher in summer, and in winter it's lower and penetrates deeper into that space. It's cooler in winter at night and just generally down there, and it's generally cooler in summer as well, but obviously the ambient temperature is warmer. I try to mist these orchids with a mister whenever I remember, but humidity isn't such an issue. And in Melbourne, we have kind of average humidity that ranges from sort of 40 to 60. So it's kind of in that middle bandwidth. And our house doesn't have central heating, so it's not particularly dry. So try to water it more in summer, and I just water everything less in winter. I feed in the warmer seasons and I don't feed in winter. Although, if it was doing something and growing, I might use a diluted liquid solution of a tonic, not a feed. So something like a seaweed-based solution or something from the runoff from a worm farm, which you can dilute. Always really dilute it down. Don't overdo it. You know, 1/8, 1/10 of what's recommended. And if you have such a thing and it's not flowering, 9 times out of 10, I would suggest, well, first thing is it might not be old enough to flower. Second point would probably be it's not getting enough light. That is generally the reason why orchids won't flower for you in cultivation. Asterix, it's not always the case, but so this one, when I repotted it, so it came in plastic pot from the nursery, the flower was dead, so I repotted it immediately as it had a new growth emerging, which is often the case. So when a new growth is coming, it's a pretty good time to repot, and that could be at any time. These hybrids will put on growth throughout the year, so it's not as seasonal as other things. I would just avoid doing it on extreme days like today. It's super hot or super cold. And just be careful not to overwater when you've repotted. Really just see what the plant's doing. And when it's starting to put out lots of roots, an obvious time to start dialing up your watering. I wouldn't let it dry out completely, but just really pare back and maybe just moisten the top of it until the plant's really started to get going. Because if you put a plant in new potting material that isn't doing anything root-wise, it's just sitting there. And if you continually water it, it's just going to get very soggy. And as the books say, root rot is a problem for this type, and you'll probably rot the roots, which I have done. But I think, you know, you can kind of treat these Oncidium hybrids as your average pot plant. Bright indirect light, water it on a needs basis, water it less in winter, look at what the plant's doing and follow its lead. Now, potting. Look at this. Mine's in terracotta because, of course, I'm a terracotta pot kind of guy, and I probably would have drilled this had I had my diamond tip drill bits when I repotted this. I've made a video about making your own drilled orchid pots, which I'll link. And as per some of those descriptions, running. Now, this one is definitely exhibiting some Miltonia characteristics. And I would say too, looking at the flower, so it's a cross between the species ancestor types are Oncidium, Miltonia, and Brassica. And I think we can see from the flowers that that Miltonia gene is very strong in terms of the flower, I feel, just for the distribution and the size of the petals and the sepals. And these sort of whiskery bits reminds me very much of some Miltonias that I have. Beautiful thing. And I also think this running habit is very, very, well, yeah, Miltonia type, but there are some Oncidium species too that run and want to climb as well, and they're a nightmare to pot. Which brings me to this. What am I going to do? What you can see is, so this was a back bulb division by the grower there, who was the one supplying the nursery. So what I'd be tempted to do, I think, when this is finished flowering, is maybe depot it, and then maybe trim off some of these back pseudobulbs and move the whole plant further across and in so that this part of the rhizome has more chance to send out roots that can anchor themselves in the medium. So that is probably what I will do. I think once the pseudobulb has lost its leaves, like this one there, I think it's quite safe to remove that. And in fact, you know, what you could almost even do with this is literally just chop it off here, propagate this, and you'll probably start to get new growths from this too. But I'm not here to divide the plant, really just to pot it better. Now, I can't mount things because it's just tricky in my climate to keep them moist, particularly in summer. Things dry out so quickly. You'd have to have a watering or a spraying system to keep it moist. So that ain't an option for me. If it were, I think this would be something that would do much better mounted, possibly. It would just allow that climbing, running habit to be taken care of. Now, the other sad thing about this plant, which you might not be able to see, but I'll try and come in and show you. You see, the new growth is not as prosperous, so the leaf hasn't really matured properly and it's discolored because I was subject to a virulent aphid infection over summer inside. I've never really had aphids so much. And what they love is new growth. So the new growths and flower spikes. So as the flower spikes emerging, the buds of the flowers, the aphids love because these sheaths are still really soft and they can get their proboscis in to suck the lifeblood out. Ditto with the new growth. So I was having to spray this like every 3 days, but the aphids really caused quite a lot of damage to this new leaf, which is sad. However, these things are tough, and I am quite sure it's going to put out a new growth and begin this whole magic cycle again. And when it does, I shall repot it. Other than that, pestilence wise, I think these Oncidium hybrids are fairly tough. You might get mealybugs on them. You can get mealybugs on most things, and aphids, as I've had. And treat those as you would, basically. Mealybugs, I often use an old toothbrush with rubbing alcohol to get them off. You can use rubbing alcohol for many things actually, because they do not like it. But you can also just use a spray. Particularly with aphids, particularly if you've got to be spraying them sort of every couple of days to catch the cycle of the new hatchlings, it's just sometimes easier. Depends what is going on. But there's no magic wand for pests and dealing with it, unfortunately. Everyone will have their own version of garlic sprays or rubbing alcohol or out of the bottle pump action sprays. But there we are. No fragrance really. I mean, some Oncidium types have the most beautiful fragrance, the Sherry Baby types being the most common of that, but a few of mine have incredible fragrance. This doesn't, but the flower size and shape is just incredible. So very, very decorative, as you can see. A great plant to grow and to have inside, and relatively easy to find, and relatively easy to grow indoors without any sort of super trickery. That if you like your conditions, these will. So there we are, plant lovers. I think we have covered everything about this unknown beauty, which came to me at a discount price because the flower spike was dead, which is a good handy home hint. Buy your orchids with dead flower spikes from growers because they tend to discount them, and then you have the joy of figuring out what is it going to look like. And sometimes you can be pleasurably surprised and sometimes not, because I've actually just seen a cattleya of mine that's opening out there and it's really gaudy and horrible. Anyway, I shall love it and then maybe pass it on. Anyway, plant lovers, if you want to know what I'm doing next week, you will have to hit subscribe because I do post every Friday. My ramblings are very amateurish, but I wanted to share this with you today because it's stunning. Now, I hope all's well in your world, whatever's going on. I hope your orchids are treating you well and you're treating yourself well. And I very much look forward to seeing you next week.